The dawn broke softly over Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, its golden hues casting a serene glow on the bustling terminal. Ethan Carter adjusted his sleek navy blazer, his polished leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the tiled floor. Everything about him screamed precision and control, from his neatly combed hair to the immaculate leather briefcase he carried. To Ethan, every minute mattered, and every second lost was a failure. His mind whirred with a relentless checklist of emails, presentations, and the high-stakes business meeting awaiting him in Los Angeles. As he approached the boarding gate, Ethan allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Flying first class wasn't just a luxury, it was a symbol of his hard-earned success. He loved the perks, the priority boarding, the spacious seats, the exclusive treatment. It was a constant reminder that he had made it. The intercom buzzed, announcing the boarding for first-class passengers. Ethan strode confidently forward, barely noticing the others around him. A young couple behind him whispered excitedly about their honeymoon, and an elderly woman chatted softly with a companion, but their words blurred into background noise. Ethan had no time for idle conversations. Settling into his plush seat near the window, Ethan opened his laptop, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he reviewed his presentation. His thoughts were interrupted only when a cheerful flight attendant, her name tag reading Sophia Mitchell, offered him a drink. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. Can I get you a coffee or orange juice before takeoff?" she asked, her warm smile a contrast to his curt nod. "Black coffee, please," he replied without looking up, his tone clipped but not unkind. As the plane filled with passengers, Ethan barely noticed the steady stream of people walking past. He was lost in his world, a world where only results mattered. That was until a calm yet unmistakable presence brought his focus elsewhere. An older man, dressed in a simple brown cardigan and well-worn loafers, stepped into the first-class cabin. His movements were unhurried, his demeanor quietly assured. With salt-and-pepper hair and a kind face etched with wisdom, he carried himself with an air of understated dignity. Ethan's gaze flickered toward him briefly. First class? The thought crossed his mind, tinged with disbelief. The man didn't fit the image of someone Ethan expected to see in this section. He carried no briefcase, wore no suit, and seemed entirely out of place among the polished and pretentious. The older man paused briefly, his eyes scanning the row numbers before finding his seat, coincidentally right next to Ethan. As he eased into the chair, Ethan caught a faint whiff of cedar and something comforting, like the scent of an old library. The man placed a dog-eared novel on the tray table and looked out the window with a serene expression, seemingly oblivious to Ethan's curious glances. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't accustomed to sharing space with people who didn't fit his perception of first-class travelers. Yet there was something disarming about this man's calm presence, something that quietly challenged Ethan's unspoken assumptions. Before he could dwell on it further, the intercom announced the final boarding call, and the cabin doors closed with a hiss. Sophia reappeared, assisting passengers with last-minute adjustments and ensuring everyone was settled. Her demeanor brightened noticeably when she approached the older man. "Good morning, Mr. Freeman. It's an honor to have you with us today," she said with genuine warmth. The man, now addressed as Morgan Freeman, smiled gently and nodded. "Thank you, Sophia. It's good to be here." Ethan froze. Morgan Freeman? The name sounded familiar, almost too familiar, but he couldn't place it immediately. He glanced at the man again, trying to make sense of this unexpected development. The man returned Ethan's gaze briefly, his eyes twinkling with quiet amusement as if he could sense Ethan's confusion. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Ethan found himself unnerved by the contrast between himself and the older man. While Ethan exuded control and purpose, Morgan Freeman radiated ease and wisdom. It was a quiet presence, but one that felt unshakable, like a tree that had weathered countless storms. The engines roared to life, signaling the beginning of the journey. Ethan leaned back in his seat, but for the first time in years, he struggled to focus. His thoughts were no longer on the spreadsheets and presentations waiting for him in Los Angeles. Instead, they circled around the calm, mysterious man sitting beside him, and the unsettling sense that this flight would change more than just his location. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the hum of the engines provided a steady backdrop to the activity in the cabin. Ethan Carter shifted slightly in his seat, trying to ignore the mild discomfort gnawing at him. The older man beside him, Morgan Freeman, as the flight attendant had called him, seemed utterly at peace, his hands resting lightly on his lap. He exuded a quiet presence, one that felt oddly out of place amidst the hurried energy of the business-class cabin. Morgan Freeman leaned back, his gaze briefly meeting Ethan's before returning to the window. His posture was relaxed, almost meditative, and his every movement spoke of someone unbothered by the trivialities of the world. In stark contrast, Ethan sat upright, stiff, with an air of superiority that seemed almost rehearsed. Unable to help himself, Ethan decided to engage. There was something about this man that piqued his curiosity. "So," Ethan began, his tone measured and polite, but with a hint of incredulity, "you fly first class often?" Morgan turned slowly, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "Not often, no," he replied, his voice deep and resonant, carrying a calm that seemed to fill the space between them. Ethan couldn't resist a faint smirk. "Not often?" The answer only fueled his skepticism. First-class seats weren't for the occasional traveler, he thought. They were for people like him, seasoned professionals who earned their place here. "Interesting," Ethan said, his voice betraying a slight edge. "What line of work are you in?" Morgan's smile deepened, his response unhurried. "Oh, I've had many jobs over the years. These days I focus on enjoying the moments I have left. Time has a way of teaching you that some things are more valuable than work." The simplicity of his words unsettled Ethan. There was no mention of status, no subtle brag about wealth or power. For someone sitting in first class, Morgan Freeman seemed remarkably detached from the trappings of success that Ethan valued so highly. The conversation was interrupted as the flight attendant, Sophia Mitchell, returned to offer Morgan a drink. "Would you like anything, Mr. Freeman? Perhaps some tea or water?" she asked, her tone noticeably more respectful than when she'd spoken to Ethan earlier. "Tea would be lovely, thank you, Sophia," Morgan replied, his smile radiating gratitude. Ethan watched the interaction, noting the ease with which Morgan connected with Sophia. She lingered a moment longer, exchanging a few friendly words with him before moving on. It struck Ethan as odd. People didn't usually stick around for small talk with passengers, but there was something about Morgan, an aura of warmth and approachability that seemed to draw others in. Curiosity battled with irritation in Ethan's mind. Who was this man, and why did he seem so comfortable in a world that should, by all appearances, feel foreign to him? Ethan's own achievements had been hard-won, built on years of relentless ambition and self-discipline. He couldn't fathom how someone could exude such quiet confidence without the visible markers of success to back it up. Morgan seemed to sense Ethan's unease. "You seem like a man with a lot on your mind," he said, his tone gentle but probing. Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the statement. "Just work," he replied curtly, deflecting. "Big meeting in L.A." "Ah," Morgan said, nodding as though he understood more than Ethan had said. "Important work, I'm sure." Ethan bristled slightly. Was that sarcasm or genuine interest? He couldn't tell, and it annoyed him. "Yes, it is," Ethan replied firmly. "Work is what gets you places, you know." Morgan leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Work has its place," he said simply, "but so does knowing when to pause and appreciate what's around you." Ethan looked away, his frustration simmering. This man was starting to sound like one of those inspirational posters he'd seen in break rooms. Yet there was an undeniable weight to his words, as though they came from a place of deep experience. Morgan, seemingly unaware of Ethan's discomfort, picked up his dog-eared novel and began reading. Ethan stole a glance at the title, Of Mice and Men. A classic, he thought. Fitting, somehow. As the flight continued, Ethan found himself stealing more glances at Morgan. There was a quiet dignity in the way he read, his finger occasionally tracing a line of text as though savoring each word. His presence was both calming and disarming, a stark contrast to the rushed, transactional energy Ethan was so used to in his own life. The moment lingered, stretching between them like an unspoken challenge. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter, this man, was more significant than he could yet understand. And, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, it unsettled him deeply. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin as Ethan Carter glanced at his watch, mentally calculating the time until the flight landed. His conversation with Morgan Freeman, while brief, had left an unusual impression on him. Still, Ethan dismissed the older man's calm demeanor as irrelevant. He had more pressing concerns, like ensuring the deal he was flying to Los Angeles to close went smoothly. Morgan, meanwhile, appeared utterly content, immersed in his well-worn copy of Mice and Men. His slow, deliberate page-turning seemed almost out of place in the fast-paced world Ethan inhabited. Ethan found the man's serenity both perplexing and, if he were honest with himself, slightly irritating. Unable to suppress his curiosity and his growing sense of superiority, Ethan leaned slightly toward Morgan. "So," he began, his voice tinged with mock politeness, "what's the occasion? Retirement trip? Anniversary?" Morgan looked up from his book, his eyes crinkling with a gentle smile. "No special occasion," he replied warmly. "Just life. It's worth celebrating, wouldn't you say?" The simplicity of Morgan's response only fueled Ethan's skepticism. He raised an eyebrow, his tone shifting toward condescension. "First class doesn't seem like your typical seat. Splurging for a change?" Morgan chuckled softly, unfazed by Ethan's words. "I suppose you could say that," he said, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that made Ethan's remark seem petty by comparison. Ethan felt his irritation rise. Who does this guy think he is? He thought. The man was so calm, so unbothered by the implied insult, that it almost felt as though he were in control of the conversation, a dynamic Ethan was not accustomed to. Determined to reassert his dominance, Ethan leaned back in his seat and let out a short, derisive laugh. "Well, enjoy it while it lasts," Ethan said, his voice dripping with a forced cheerfulness. "First class isn't exactly for everyone. Most people don't have the stomach or the wallet for it." Morgan met Ethan's gaze steadily, his expression neither offended nor amused. Instead, there was a flicker of something Ethan couldn't quite place. Empathy, perhaps? Whatever it was, it unsettled him more than any retort could have. Sophia, the flight attendant, passed by at that moment, and Ethan seized the opportunity to continue his veiled jabs. "Sophia," he called out, motioning her over. "Can you believe how full first class is today? I mean, it's great to see, but it's not exactly the exclusive experience it used to be." Sophia's polite smile faltered slightly as her eyes darted to Morgan, then back to Ethan. "Well, Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "first class is open to anyone who values the journey as much as the destination." Morgan's faint smile grew as he nodded at Sophia's words. "That's very well put," he said, his deep, soothing voice adding weight to her sentiment. "The journey does matter, sometimes more than the destination." Ethan barely suppressed a scoff. "Sure," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "But let's be real. Most people are here for the perks, not the philosophy." Morgan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he closed his book gently, setting it down on his lap. "You're right," he said after a moment, his tone calm but firm. "Many people do chase the perks, but in doing so they often miss the real luxury, the chance to connect, to learn, and to grow." The words hung in the air, their weight cutting through Ethan's self-assured facade. For a brief moment he felt a flicker of something. Shame, perhaps. but he quickly pushed it aside. "Well," Ethan said, forcing a chuckle, "that's one way to look at it." Morgan smiled again, this time with a quiet understanding that seemed to unsettle Ethan even more. He picked up his book once more, signaling the end of the conversation. Ethan, left with no one to impress, turned back to his laptop, but his focus was fractured. The older man's words echoed in his mind, unwelcome and persistent. As the plane continued its steady path toward Los Angeles, Ethan found himself glancing at Morgan from time to time. There was something about him, a quiet strength, an unshakable sense of self, that Ethan couldn't ignore. It wasn't arrogance, it was something deeper, something Ethan couldn't quite define, and for the first time in a long time, he began to wonder if the way he viewed the world, and his place in it, was as secure as he had always believed. The cabin settled into a comfortable rhythm, the soft clinking of cups and the occasional murmur of passengers blending with the steady hum of the engines. Ethan Carter, now thoroughly entrenched in his laptop, couldn't help but glance at the older man beside him. Morgan Freeman had resumed reading his novel, his expression as serene as ever, as if Ethan's earlier remarks hadn't even grazed him. Ethan shifted in his seat, the weight of Morgan's calm presence unsettling. He was accustomed to commanding attention, to his words leaving a mark, be it admiration, envy, or annoyance. But Morgan seemed impervious, like a stone smoothed by years of flowing water. His refusal to react only amplified Ethan's frustration. Unable to resist, Ethan leaned slightly closer. "You know," he said, his tone deliberately casual, "most people would have had something to say back by now. You're surprisingly quiet." Morgan turned the page of his book with deliberate slowness before looking up. His eyes, warm yet piercing, held Ethan's gaze. "Not everything needs a reaction," he said gently. "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words." The simplicity of Morgan's reply struck Ethan in a way he hadn't anticipated. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself momentarily at a loss. Morgan's ability to remain composed felt like an unspoken challenge, a calm defiance that made Ethan's barbs feel trivial and juvenile. Morgan continued, his voice steady but thoughtful. "You see, Mr. Carter, when someone speaks, they often reveal more about themselves than the person they're addressing. It's a lesson life teaches, if we're willing to listen." Ethan felt a flicker of discomfort at the subtle implication, though Morgan's tone was free of malice. Instead, it carried an undeniable wisdom, like the voice of a teacher who had seen more than his students could comprehend. Ethan attempted a laugh, brushing off the remark. "Well, I suppose you've had plenty of time to gather those lessons," he quipped, his words laced with an edge of sarcasm. Morgan didn't flinch. "Time is a gift," he said, his gaze unwavering. "The question is, how do we use it? Do we spend it proving ourselves, or do we spend it becoming ourselves?" The air between them seemed to grow heavier, the weight of Morgan's words settling into the space like a presence all its own. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his confidence eroding under the quiet strength of the older man's demeanor. He had come into this conversation expecting dominance, but Morgan had offered something far more disarming: humility. The silence stretched, and for a moment, Ethan considered letting the conversation end. But something about Morgan's presence, his calm, his steadiness, made it impossible for Ethan to move on. "You're awfully philosophical for someone on a plane," Ethan said finally, his voice softer than before, almost unsure. Morgan chuckled softly, a sound that carried no judgment, only understanding. "Philosophy has a way of finding you," he said, "especially when you've had enough turbulence in life to appreciate smooth skies." The metaphor lingered, its resonance undeniable. Ethan felt the sting of its truth, though he wasn't sure why. He looked away, his gaze falling on the glowing screen of his laptop. The spreadsheet that had once consumed his thoughts now seemed trivial, a collection of numbers that, in the grand scheme of things, meant very little. Sophia approached, her presence breaking the tension. "Can I get either of you anything?" she asked, her warm smile directed at both men. Morgan glanced at Ethan as if inviting him to speak first. Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "No, thank you," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual bravado. Morgan smiled at Sophia. "I'm fine, thank you, but I appreciate you checking in." As Sophia walked away, Ethan found himself staring out the window, the endless expanse of clouds stretching like a canvas beneath the plane. Morgan's words replayed in his mind, their simplicity and sincerity cutting through the noise of his usual thoughts. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something he couldn't quite name, a vulnerability, a crack in the armor he'd spent years perfecting. Morgan, sensing Ethan's introspection, returned to his book without another word. His calm was unyielding, a quiet force that required no justification. It wasn't arrogance or superiority. It was something deeper, something earned. Ethan glanced at him one last time, the questions swirling in his mind too numerous to voice. Who was this man? How had he become so unshakably grounded? And why did his presence feel like both a challenge and an invitation? As the plane continued its steady journey, Ethan found himself sitting with an unfamiliar sensation, the beginnings of humility. And, though he didn't know it yet, the lesson Morgan Freeman was teaching him had already begun to take root. The flight had reached a quiet lull, with most passengers either absorbed in their books, films, or simply gazing out at the soft expanse of clouds. Ethan Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, stealing another glance at the older man beside him. Despite Ethan's earlier attempts to assert dominance, Morgan Freeman sat with the same calm dignity, flipping through his dog-eared novel with an ease that belied the gravity of his words. Ethan couldn't shake the sense of curiosity gnawing at him. The man had to be someone important. There was a presence about him that commanded attention without demanding it. Still, the notion seemed absurd. Important people didn't come wrapped in cardigans and travel-worn shoes. They arrived polished, powerful, unmistakable, like Ethan himself. Sophia Mitchell, the attentive flight attendant, reappeared, moving gracefully through the aisle as she checked on the passengers. When she reached their row, her eyes lit up with a warmth Ethan couldn't help but notice. Her demeanor toward Morgan was subtly different, more respectful, almost reverent. "Mr. Freeman," she said with a smile, "can I bring you anything else? Perhaps another cup of tea?" Ethan froze. His mind stumbled over her words. Freeman. The name echoed in his thoughts, familiar and yet ungraspable. He turned to Morgan, his confusion barely masked. Morgan looked up from his book, his calm smile unwavering. "I'm fine, thank you, Sophia," he replied, his deep, resonant voice carrying a quiet grace. "But I do appreciate you asking." Sophia nodded and lingered a moment as if reluctant to leave his presence. "It's truly an honor to have you on board, sir," she added, her sincerity cutting through the cabin's hum. Then, with a polite nod, she moved on to the next row. Ethan stared at Morgan, his earlier skepticism now replaced by dawning realization. He leaned closer, his voice lowering as if afraid to disturb the air around them. "Wait a second," he said, his tone edged with disbelief. "Morgan Freeman? Like the Morgan Freeman?" Morgan glanced at him, his expression calm and knowing. "I'm afraid so," he said with a hint of amusement, "though I didn't realize I needed the definite article." Ethan's mouth opened and closed, his usual confidence momentarily faltering. I didn't recognize you," he stammered, feeling a surge of embarrassment rise in his chest. "I mean, you're Morgan Freeman. You're like a legend." Morgan chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling. "I've been told that," he said, "though I try not to think of myself in those terms. Makes it harder to keep my feet on the ground." Ethan could feel the heat rising to his face. He thought back to his earlier remarks, his condescension, his mockery of a man who clearly belonged in first class far more than Ethan himself. The weight of his arrogance pressed heavily on him now, a sharp contrast to the effortless humility Morgan exuded. I'm sorry if I came across as—" Ethan trailed off, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't realize who you were." Morgan raised a hand, his gesture as gentle as his voice. "No need to apologize," he said. "You were simply being yourself. That's the only way I can get to know someone after all." The words were kind, but they carried a subtle depth that left Ethan feeling exposed. He realized that Morgan wasn't judging him, but neither was he excusing him. It was a lesson wrapped in grace, a mirror held up to Ethan's behavior, challenging him to look at himself more honestly. The revelation spread through Ethan's mind like ripples in a pond. All the confidence he'd carried onto the plane now felt hollow, dwarfed by the quiet power of the man beside him. Morgan Freeman wasn't just a famous actor or a household name. He was a presence, a force of nature that seemed to embody wisdom, patience, and humanity in equal measure. Ethan glanced around the cabin, wondering if anyone else had noticed the living legend sitting among them. But Morgan seemed perfectly content to blend in, to exist without fanfare. It struck Ethan as both strange and profoundly admirable. Here was a man who could command attention effortlessly, and yet he chose not to. As Morgan returned to his book, Ethan found himself replaying their earlier interactions in his mind. Every word Morgan had spoken now carried greater weight, imbued with the gravitas of who he was. Ethan felt a pang of regret for his earlier arrogance, but he also felt something else, something he couldn't quite name. Respect, perhaps, or inspiration. Whatever it was, it left him unsettled, yet strangely hopeful. The rest of the flight passed in a quiet reflection for Ethan. He stole glances at Morgan from time to time, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of a growing admiration. For the first time, Ethan wasn't thinking about his meeting, his spreadsheets, or his carefully constructed image. Instead, he was thinking about something far deeper, the kind of man he wanted to be. The revelation of Morgan Freeman's identity left Ethan Carter in a state of quiet turmoil. The man he had dismissed, even mocked, had turned out to be a living legend, someone whose name carried immense respect and admiration. And yet, Morgan had treated him with nothing but patience, grace, and humility. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual confidence now tinged with a sense of inadequacy. His mind raced with thoughts, each one vying for his attention. He wanted to say something, anything to erase the sting of his earlier arrogance, but words felt insufficient, clumsy in the face of Morgan's calm composure. Morgan, for his part, seemed entirely unaffected by the shift in dynamic. He closed his book gently, folding the corner of a page with deliberate care before setting it down on the tray table. He turned to Ethan, his expression thoughtful but kind, as though he had been waiting for this moment. "You seem troubled," Morgan said softly, his voice carrying the same resonance that had captivated audiences for decades. "Is something on your mind?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of the question pressing against his chest. He wanted to brush it off, to deflect with a quick remark, but something about Morgan's tone made it impossible. There was no judgment in it, only an invitation to be honest. Ethan began, his voice faltering. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I guess I didn't realize who you were. And now, looking back, I feel like I made a fool of myself." Morgan leaned back slightly, his gaze steady but gentle. "Do you think you're the first person to misjudge someone?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It happens more often than you might think." Ethan frowned, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of such direct honesty, especially not from someone like Morgan Freeman. "Still," he said after a moment, "it feels different. I should have known better." Morgan's smile deepened, a quiet understanding radiating from him. "Knowing better isn't about avoiding mistakes," he said. "It's about learning from them. The question isn't whether you misjudged me, it's whether you're willing to see things differently now." The words struck Ethan like a chord, resonating in a way that made him feel both exposed and understood. He thought about all the times he had made snap judgments, about people, about situations, even about himself. It was an uncomfortable realization, one that forced him to confront parts of himself he had long ignored. "I guess I've always been quick to judge," Ethan admitted, the words coming out slower than he intended. "It's just easier, to look at someone and decide what they're about." Morgan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Easier, yes," he said, "but not always right. People are more than what you see on the surface. They carry stories, struggles, and triumphs that you can't possibly know at first glance. When you judge too quickly, you rob yourself of the chance to learn from them." Ethan felt a pang of guilt at the truth of Morgan's words. He thought about his colleagues, his clients, even strangers he passed on the street. How often had he written them off without a second thought? How many connections had he missed because he was too wrapped up in his own perspective? Morgan continued, his voice steady but imbued with emotion. "The real measure of a person isn't in their wealth or their title. It's in how they treat others, especially those they have nothing to gain from. Respect and humility. They're not just for others. They're for yourself, too." Ethan looked down at his hands, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Morgan's words were simple, but they carried a weight that felt impossible to ignore. He realized for the first time that his success had come at a cost he hadn't even noticed until now. In his pursuit of achievement, he had lost sight of the things that truly mattered. "Do you ever wonder," Ethan asked quietly, "if it's too late to change?" Morgan's gaze softened, and he reached out to place a steady hand on Ethan's arm. "It's never too late," he said firmly. "The moment you decide to see the world differently, you've already started to change. It's not about erasing the past. It's about choosing how to move forward." The sincerity in Morgan's voice brought an unexpected lump to Ethan's throat. He swallowed hard, feeling a mix of gratitude and shame. Gratitude for the wisdom Morgan had shared, and shame for the arrogance that had blinded him for so long. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them, but it no longer felt empty. Instead, it carried the weight of a moment that Ethan knew he would carry with him long after the plane touched down. As Morgan picked up his book again, Ethan leaned back in his seat, his mind quieter than it had been in years. For the first time, he allowed himself to simply sit with the discomfort, to let it teach him. And though he didn't know what lay ahead, he felt a small but profound shift within himself, a seed of humility taking root. The engines droned softly as the plane began its slow descent toward Los Angeles. Outside, the sun hung low on the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of gold and pink. But Ethan Carter wasn't paying attention to the view. His gaze was fixed on the tray table in front of him, his thoughts an uncharacteristic tangle of doubt and introspection. Morgan Freeman's words echoed in his mind, refusing to fade. "It's not about erasing the past. It's about choosing how to move forward." The statement carried a weight that Ethan couldn't shake, as if it had peeled back a layer of armor he hadn't realized he was wearing. He shifted in his seat, his discomfort not physical but emotional. For years, he had prided himself on his accomplishments, his ability to climb higher and push harder than anyone around him. Yet, in this moment, he felt small, not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that made him see the vastness of what he'd been missing. Ethan stole a glance at Morgan, who sat quietly reading, his expression as serene as it had been throughout the flight. The man exuded a kind of peace that Ethan didn't understand but desperately wanted to. How could someone who had achieved so much remain so grounded, so free of the arrogance that had come to define Ethan's own success? His thoughts drifted to moments from his past, times when he had judged too quickly, spoken too harshly, or dismissed others for not meeting his expectations. He remembered the assistant he had chastised in front of an entire team for a minor mistake, the colleague he had undermined to secure a promotion, the countless strangers he had written off as unimportant. The memories hit him like waves, each one carrying a sting of regret. He had always justified his actions as necessary, a byproduct of ambition, but now, for the first time, he saw them for what they were: choices. Choices he had made to prioritize his ego over connection, his success over humanity. Ethan's chest tightened, a feeling he recognized as shame but also something deeper, an ache, a longing for a different version of himself. He thought of Morgan's words about respect and humility, about seeing people for more than their surface. The idea seemed so simple, yet it felt monumental, like trying to move a mountain with bare hands. He sighed softly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his reflection. "I've been such a fool," he murmured, barely realizing he had spoken aloud. Morgan looked up from his book, his calm eyes meeting Ethan's. "Foolishness," he said, his voice steady, "is refusing to see your own mistakes. Recognizing them. That's wisdom." Ethan blinked, startled by the clarity of Morgan's response. "It doesn't feel like wisdom," he admitted. "It feels like I've wasted so much time being wrong." Morgan's gaze softened, his expression one of understanding. "Wasted time is only wasted if you let it be," he said. "What matters is what you choose to do now. Every moment is a chance to begin again." The simplicity of the statement hit Ethan like a breath of fresh air. He felt the knot in his chest begin to loosen, replaced by a quiet resolve. It wasn't too late. He could still change, still become the kind of person he had always admired but never thought to emulate. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his thoughts shifting from regret to possibility. He began to imagine what his life might look like if he approached it differently, if he led with kindness instead of arrogance, with understanding instead of judgment. The idea felt foreign but also invigorating, like stepping onto a path he hadn't known existed. Sophia, the flight attendant, appeared once more, her warm smile a welcome interruption. "Gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Can I get you anything before we begin our descent?" Morgan shook his head, his gratitude evident in his tone. "Thank you, Sophia, but I'm all set." Ethan hesitated, then offered a small smile. "I'm fine, too. Thanks." Sophia nodded and moved on, leaving the two men in a comfortable silence. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel the need to fill it with words or distractions. He simply let the moment be, allowing himself to sit with the weight of his reflection and the glimmer of hope it carried. As the plane began its final approach, Ethan looked out the window, the sprawling city of Los Angeles coming into view. The sun's rays danced across the horizon, and for a brief moment he felt a sense of peace. Not the kind that came from achieving something, but the kind that came from letting go. He turned to Morgan, his voice quieter than before. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Morgan smiled, his expression warm and knowing. "You're welcome," he said. "But remember, the thanks isn't for me. It's for yourself, for being willing to grow." Ethan nodded, the truth of Morgan's words settling over him like a blanket. As the wheels touched down on the runway, he felt a quiet determination take root. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was ready to face it with a new perspective. As the plane taxied toward the gate, a stillness settled over the cabin. Passengers began gathering their belongings, some chatting excitedly about their plans in Los Angeles, others scrolling through their phones. Ethan Carter sat quietly, his laptop still tucked away, his usual rush to exit nowhere to be found. His mind was consumed not by his upcoming meeting, but by the older man beside him. Morgan Freeman placed his book back into his small carry-on, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Ethan couldn't help but notice the care Morgan gave to even the smallest of tasks, as if every moment, no matter how mundane, carried significance. It was a stark contrast to Ethan's own habit of rushing through life, treating each action as a means to an end. Ethan hesitated, unsure how to approach what he wanted to say. He had spent the better part of the flight in quiet reflection, his heart stirred by Morgan's words and presence. Now, as the journey neared its end, he felt an urgency to express his gratitude, even if he wasn't sure how to articulate it. Morgan seemed to sense Ethan's hesitation. He turned to him, his expression patient and inviting. "You have something on your mind," he said gently. "Go ahead." Ethan swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He began, his voice faltering. He let out a shaky breath and tried again. "I wanted to thank you for what you said earlier. It made me think about a lot of things, about myself, and I think I've been living the wrong way." Morgan's eyes softened and a faint smile curved his lips. "There's no shame in realizing that," he said. "In fact, it takes courage to admit it. Most people spend their whole lives avoiding that kind of honesty." Ethan nodded, the lump in his throat growing. I've always thought success was about being the best, about proving I'm better than everyone else. But now I'm starting to wonder if I've been climbing the wrong mountain." Morgan leaned forward slightly, his voice low and steady. "The world has a way of convincing us that success is about what we have, what we achieve, or how we're seen. But real success isn't about any of that. It's about who we are, how we treat others, how we grow, and how we make the world a little better for having been in it." The words hit Ethan like a wave, washing over the walls he had spent years building around himself. He felt his eyes burn, and he blinked rapidly, unwilling to let the emotion spill over. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Morgan's smile deepened, radiating warmth and understanding. "Start where you are," he said. "Every step forward, no matter how small, is a step worth taking. Be kind, be curious, and remember that it's never too late to choose a new path." Ethan nodded, the weight of Morgan's words settling into his heart. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't even realized he was missing. Hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from external achievements or recognition. It was quieter, deeper, an inner belief that change was possible. The plane came to a stop, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers stood and began reaching for their bags, the hum of conversation filling the cabin once more. Ethan remained seated, watching as Morgan calmly gathered his belongings. The older man's movements carried a sense of finality, as though this chapter of their shared journey was coming to a close. As Morgan stood, Ethan rose too, feeling an odd reluctance to let the moment end. "I don't know if I'll ever see you again," Ethan said, his voice tinged with both gratitude and regret. "But I want you to know, you've changed the way I see things, and I'll do my best to be better." Morgan placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his touch light but grounding. "You've already taken the first step," he said, "and that's the hardest one. The rest, that's just walking." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat again, but this time he didn't fight it. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying all the sincerity he could muster. Morgan nodded, his eyes twinkling with something that felt both timeless and deeply personal. "Take care, Ethan," he said, "and remember, kindness is its own kind of success." With that, Morgan turned and began making his way toward the exit. Ethan watched him go, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The older man's words replayed in his mind, each one a seed of wisdom that he knew would take root and grow in time. As he stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of his ego, his ambition, and his need for validation had started to lift, replaced by a quiet determination to live differently. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he felt ready to ask the right questions. Ethan Carter walked through the bustling terminal of LAX, his carry-on slung over one shoulder and his thoughts far from the high-stakes meeting that had once dominated his focus. The encounter with Morgan Freeman played on a loop in his mind, each word of wisdom like a pebble dropped into the still waters of his soul, creating ripples of change. As he made his way through the crowds, Ethan noticed things he'd overlooked countless times before. The harried expressions of parents juggling luggage and children, the quiet joy of a couple embracing after what seemed like a long separation, the weariness etched into the face of an elderly man struggling with his suitcase. These weren't just strangers anymore. They were people, each carrying their own stories, triumphs, and struggles. For years, Ethan had moved through life with tunnel vision, focused solely on his goals, his ambitions, his version of success. But now, for the first time, he felt an awareness of the world beyond himself. It was as though a veil had been lifted, revealing a depth and richness he had been blind to. He stopped at a coffee kiosk, the kind he usually hurried past without a second glance. The barista, a young woman with tired eyes but a genuine smile, handed him his cup. "Have a great day," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that Ethan realized he'd often ignored. "You too," he replied, meeting her gaze and offering a smile in return. The interaction was brief, but it felt different, more intentional, more human. As he sipped his coffee and found a quiet corner to sit, Ethan pulled out his phone. His instinct was to check emails, to dive back into the routine that had defined him for so long. But instead, he opened the Notes app and began to type. It wasn't a work-related checklist or a polished pitch. It was raw, unfiltered thoughts, questions, realizations, and the seeds of a new perspective. How do I measure success? Who am I when no one's watching? What kind of legacy do I want to leave? The questions felt uncomfortable yet necessary, like stretching a muscle that had long been neglected. He didn't have the answers, but he felt a sense of urgency to start seeking them. For too long, he had measured his worth by external markers, promotions, accolades, material possessions. Now, he realized, those things were fleeting. What mattered was the impact he left on others, the kindness he gave, the understanding he offered, the humanity he chose to embrace. Ethan's thoughts turned to his team back at the office. How many times had he dismissed their ideas without truly listening? How often had he prioritized results over relationships? He resolved to do better, to be the kind of leader who inspired rather than intimidated, who uplifted rather than dismissed. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, Kara. "Hope your flight went well. Just a reminder, the meeting is in 2 hours. Let me know if you need anything." Ethan stared at the screen, the words blending into the background as he thought about Kara. She was diligent, resourceful, and always went above and beyond. Yet how often had he acknowledged her efforts? How often had he taken her for granted? He typed a response, his fingers moving with a newfound intention. "Thanks, Kara. I appreciate all you do. Let's schedule some time next week to go over your goals. I'd like to make sure you're getting the opportunities you deserve." The message was simple, but it felt monumental. For Ethan, it was the first step in a journey of redefining himself, not as a man driven by ego, but as someone striving to leave a positive impact. As the minutes passed, Ethan noticed a growing sense of clarity. It wasn't that his problems had disappeared or that he suddenly had all the answers. It was that he felt equipped to face them differently, with humility and grace. He thought about Morgan's parting words. Kindness is its own kind of success. Ethan leaned back in his seat, letting those words settle over him like a balm. He realized that success wasn't a finish line to be crossed or a trophy to be displayed. It was a way of being, a choice made moment by moment. And for the first time in years, he felt ready to choose differently. Nearby, a child dropped her stuffed toy and without hesitation, Ethan rose to pick it up and hand it back to her. The girl beamed, her gratitude pure and unfiltered, and Ethan felt a flicker of joy in his chest. A joy that came not from being praised or recognized, but from simply doing good. As he made his way toward the exit, Ethan felt lighter, as though he had shed a part of himself that no longer served him.